This seemed like a good time to do a check-in on the RFK Jr. candidacy. We've talked about President Trump, President Biden a lot here on this podcast, but there is an independent candidate who is making some noise in some of these national polls and perhaps siphoning off voters from Trump and Biden. So we want to talk a little bit more about RFK Jr., his running mate, and what the lay of the land looks like for this independent candidate. And joining me to do that is Hanna Trudo. She's the senior political correspondent for The Hill. She's been covering RFK Jr. quite a bit for The Hill, so no one better to talk to about it. Hanna, thank you for joining me here on the DC Debrief. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. So this is a good launching point. This week, as a lot of people know right now, that he announced who his running mate was going to be, a political neophyte named Nicole Shanahan. Tell us a little bit about her, because I don't think any of us have ever heard of her before this week. What do we know about her?
Yeah, that's definitely right. She came kind of out of thin air. I think for a lot of political observers, there was some speculation over the past few weeks who RFK Jr. might choose. And Nicole Shanahan definitely wasn't on too many people's short lists at the very beginning. But, you know, as we saw the list get a little bit narrower, she did start to emerge. Now, some basic facts about her. She's very, very young. She's 38 years old, which is a great sort of counter to RFK Jr.'s own age. He's 70, so that's definitely something notable about her. Obviously a woman, adding a bit of gender diversity never hurts any general election candidate, we would assume. And then more so even than that, the most notable thing I think about her is that she has a tremendous amount of money and is able to add just a much needed cash influx to RFK Jr.'s campaign. And so she comes onto the ticket as the former ex-wife of Google founder Sergey Brin. And, you know, as you can imagine, with that previous relationship, she's no longer married to him, but comes quite a bit of money.
Yeah.
So you know, Kennedy himself has said that's not the reason he chose her. There's been there's a lot of reporting about the reasons behind, you know, why he sort of was drawn to her in particular. But I think just looking at it rationally and reasonably, it definitely doesn't hurt. He's running, you know, an insurgent campaign. These kinds of efforts are extremely expensive. And, you know, she's really going to, they hope, folks in his inner circle hope, really add that layer of cash that's needed.
Now, I would imagine that there are not many voters who will make their decision on whether or not to vote for RFK Jr. because he selected Nicole Shanahan to be his running mate, right? This is about RFK Jr. here. And obviously you hear the name Kennedy and you automatically think Democrat. And as you're listening to him speak, what he talks about on the stump, the things that he cares about, there certainly does seem to be some aspects of his platform, the things that he believes in, that would appeal to Democratic voters. But I covered the Vote Pray Stand Summit for us for CBN a few months ago, and I spoke to a number of people there, mostly evangelicals, who would have loved for RFK Jr. to be Donald Trump's running mate this time around. And so there's definitely a bit of a support on the right as well. And I think, would it be fair to say that both candidates, Trump and Biden, don't really quite know how to approach the RFK Jr. candidacy or how to address it at this point? Is it still a feeling out process?
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting about the evangelical voters. I mean, one thing that I think with Shanahan in particular, I think some folks on the right, or at least more of the libertarian faction of the electorate, maybe some independents who maybe lean a little bit more right, they were actually hoping that Kennedy would choose somebody who is more right adjacent, maybe not full on right wing or Trumpism necessarily, but somebody who embodies more of their maybe free market principles or just liberty principles more broadly. And that's definitely not Shanahan. So that's adds an interesting element. You know, she's a self-described progressive, and that's an interesting choice. You know, when you're looking at Kennedy trying to appeal to both sides, right, of the electorate. He's trying to siphon off voters from both Trump and Biden, admittedly, but he did choose a running mate who is decidedly more liberal, at least in the past, and, you know, kind of made a point to disavow the Democratic Party in her speech. So like Kennedy himself has. So
Yeah.
an interesting choice for that aspect. But to your point, I mean, what Biden and Trump sort of worlds are thinking about right now is I think that they don't know exactly what to make of his campaign for one particular reason. And to me, from talking to folks in this space for the past couple of months, the key issue for both sides is really about ballot access.
Hmm.
And for Trump world, they're definitely thinking that he's going to pull more votes from Biden. And right now, we've seen a shift in the Democratic Party over the past couple of weeks, even the past week or so, I'd say, where Democrats are also starting to worry about that. So for the first couple months after he switched from the Democratic Party to an independent, folks in the Democratic Party in Biden world in the DNC, they were saying, mostly that he's going to take from Trump. We're not worried about him, or they would just ignore him. And so
Hmm.
that's really not the case anymore. We're definitely
Yeah.
starting to see a shift in that. But I think the one saving grace, at least for the Dem side, what they're thinking right now is that he won't be able to get on enough state ballots to even qualify as a viable candidate in November. And so that's kind of their hope right now. They're definitely the VP choice was required. I think they're nearly half of the states in total. I'm not sure the exact number. I think it's 24,
Hmm.
maybe 23 states require that benchmark to be
Okay.
considered a viable choice. So that obviously is why he made that decision now, as opposed to like closer to the conventions. But it's a really serious question of whether he will be able to qualify at all. And I think for Democrats, certainly that's their hope, is that he just kind of fizzles off. He doesn't have the money or the stamina or the voter appeal necessarily to get to November.
Well, and he doesn't have to get on every state ballot, but if he gets on enough of the battleground state ballots, it could certainly swing the election one way or the other. But as far as people who are looking at RFK Jr. maybe for the first time recently, that there's enough double haters out there of both President Trump and President Biden that there are some people who might be fishing for a third candidate. What is it about RFK Jr. that some of those people might gravitate to?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that's the basis of his candidacy, right? It's the fact that the both presumptive nominees are historically unpopular. He sees a lane for another choice. He does have that historical name recognition, that dynasty, American family, to kind of give him an edge that I think, we've seen some other candidates. We've seen Cornel West or Marianne Williamson, who just don't
Mhm.
have, even Jill Stein, who we remember from 2016, but who don't have that sort of clout. And so he sees the nature of the divisions within the nation on both sides of the electorate, but also just the sheer unpopularity of both major party nominees as his opening. So in terms of who might go to him, I think, his message has basically been anti-establishment. He's trying to shake up the system, and he has some populist themes. He appeals to some folks on the right, some folks on the left. I spoke to somebody who's in his sort of world the other day, who said, I've met folks from the MAGA movement who like him. I've met folks from the Bernie movement who like him. And this is somebody in New Hampshire, so that's kind of a breeding ground for this kind of message. And so I think that it's people who are two things, who are either dissatisfied with Biden and Trump in particular as the two choices, and they just say, I don't like either of these two people, these two, older men, frankly.
Mhm.
I want somebody else. Or people who are naturally more inclined to want to kind of shake up the established system of government, who see things declining over time, who see, government overreach in some cases, but also not enough government in other cases. So it's kind of a weird mix of people. And then there's a third faction who he's hoping to appeal to, I think, which doesn't get as much attention, but that's voters who are totally disengaged from the process. I mean, they might not even be considered voters until perhaps this election. And that's what he's hoping. He's hoping that his message of sort of this insurgent, somebody who, identified as a Democrat for many years, comes from that Democratic family, but no longer is with them, but also no longer, isn't quite with Trump, doesn't agree with a lot of necessarily Trump's views on things. He's hoping to kind of inspire people who maybe haven't ever voted for before to kind of show up
Mhm.
for him.
Now, I know he has had some controversial comments and opinions in the past. I think a lot of them having to do with vaccines. But what are some of the areas in which some of his critics can look at some of the things that he has said and the things that are on his platform, the things that he believes that could be considered controversial?
Yeah, I think, two things usually come up with him. The vaccine stuff is the biggest one. I mean, he has definitely challenged the conventional scientific community, the conventional sort of orthodoxy in general about certainly the administering of vaccines and the mandate, which tends to be, of course, we've seen popular on the right. That's where his more right wing faction of supporters pulls from the COVID rhetoric, but also just kind of bucking the idea that these vaccines, not just for COVID, but more broadly, are even scientifically proven to be
Mhm.
effective. So he's sort of launching this widespread attack on the scientific, established scientific community, and I think that that's touchy for a lot of people because it's not necessarily a political issue, or it hadn't been. And obviously, with COVID, we saw that become hyper political. But a lot of the COVID discussion back then was about should it be required. It wasn't exactly necessarily challenging the science behind it. Some folks were, of course,
Mhm.
in some states, some GOP states, but he's taking that conversation in another direction, and I think that that's drawing his biggest criticism.
So at this point, based on what we can see from the polling and from what I've seen over the last couple of weeks, it looks like he's drawing anywhere from 11 to 13 to even 17% in some places. That's kind of Ross Perot territory. If you remember back to 1992, I think it was, that was the election when Bill Clinton defeated George H.W. Bush. It's kind of those numbers are Ross Perot-ish, and Ross Perot absolutely had an effect on that election. Does does it look as though RFK Jr. could have that kind of an impact on this election? And if so, who do you think right now it hurts more?
Yeah, I think right now, as the numbers stand, we've seen his numbers actually stay fairly consistent, which is something that, again, Democrats in the beginning of his race were very quick to downplay. Yes, his numbers are in the double digits right now, but they're not likely to stand. We actually have seen them remain consistent, and that's, hence we're seeing more anxiety from the Democratic Party as a result. So, yeah, Ross Perot is a great example. I hear that name thrown out quite a bit because he was successful in quotes at his, some would say at his goal, or at least at a goal. And so the reality that could be the case this election, I think, strikes people as more likely than not at this
Mhm.
point. Just again, given the nature of the polarization, he doesn't seem to be going away. And like you mentioned earlier, he doesn't necessarily need to get on every state. That is his goal, 50 states and DC. But he doesn't need to. He needs to get on a handful of, like you mentioned, battlegrounds, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. We see Biden doing, quite poorly in Michigan right now. That's a critical state for the Democratic Party to hold on to. Same as Pennsylvania, his home state. So if Kennedy can even make traction in some of those areas, that's a real problem. In terms of who it hurts the most, I think we are starting to see a shift in the thinking about it hurting Biden more, just for the reasons I mentioned. But it's not, it's not 100% clear. It is. He does have definitely a right wing faction of support who might shift from Trump and go towards him.
Mhm.
But the name recognition is strong with the party. He chose a liberal running mate, which could help him with, again, Biden voters who may say, "Oh, I'm glad he chose somebody that's more Democratic leaning as his VP. I'll go with him." So all of these things kind of add up to probably hurting Biden more. But honestly, it really is anybody's guess so far out.
Yeah, the margins are so close with everything right now. Everything's within the margin of error, it seems, and so it's still a total toss-up here. But that's what makes an RFK Jr. candidacy so interesting, and depending on which side you're talking to, dangerous. But we'll see how things play out here over these next few months. And few people are covering this as well as Hanna Trudo, of course, senior political correspondent for The Hill. Make sure you follow everything she's doing over there by going to thehill.com. Lots of great stuff there on RFK Jr. and everything else. Hanna, thank you for coming on the DC Debrief. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.